All rise, veuve lever. The International Criminal Court is now in session. L'audience de la Cour pénale internationale est ouverte. Please be seated, veuve vous asseoir.
Presiding Judge, the hearing is opened. Good morning, all. Court officer, please call the case.
Good morning, Mr. President, Your Honours. This is the situation in the Republic of Mali in the case of the prosecutor versus Al Hassan Al Abdul Aziz Al Mohammed Al Mahmoud. Case reference ICC 0112-0118. And for the record, we're in open session.
Thank you very much, Court officer. I wish to welcome all those who are present here in the courtroom and welcome Mr. Al Hassan, who is present. And I would like to welcome all those who are following us from the public gallery, as well as those who are following these proceedings remotely. Now, as I do each morning, I would like to invite each of the parties and participants to introduce themselves. Office of the Prosecutor first. Prosecutor, please. Mr. Dutertre. Good morning, Your Honours. The Office of the Prosecutor this morning is represented by Marie-Claudine Umurungi, Caroline Leroy, Yaya Yamaguchi, Lucio Garcia, Gilles Dutertre, and certain other colleagues. And I'd like to greet all those who are in and around the courtroom. Presiding Judge. Thank you, Prosecutor Dutertre. I turn now to the defense. Ms. Taylor.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honours. Good morning to everyone in the courtroom and around the courtroom. The defense for Mr. Al Hassan is represented today. Going to my left, Dr. Felicity Gary, Maître Arka Pradhan, Maître Mohamed Youssef, Maître Melissa Boyou-Lucier, Maître Leila Abid, Professor Mohamed Badar, Mr. Maulud Al-Ansari, Maître Kelsey Ryan, and Ms. Brianna Dyer. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup,
Presiding Judge. Thank you, Ms. Taylor. I now turn to the legal representatives of victims. Mr. Nsita. Mr. Nsita. Good morning, Your Honours. The team of the legal representatives of victims is made up this morning of, first of all, those in the field, Ms. Janine Kapinga, Mr. Boubacar Maïga, and Mr. Saïdou Doumbia. And here in the courtroom, we have Ms. Priska Biekdipanga, we have Mr. Andrés Felipe Arias Morales, Ms. Julie Goffin, and my colleague, Mr. Mayombo Kasongo, and I myself, Mr. Nsita. I too would like to wish a good morning to all those in and around the courtroom.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Nsita.
Presiding Judge, thank you very much, Mr. Nsita. And I would particularly like to greet those legal representatives who are attending from afar. So today we have the second day of final closing arguments in this case. These arguments will be presented by the parties and the participants. This morning we are going to hear the closing statements of the legal representatives of victims. So, Mr. Nsita, you have a full session for your team as agreed yesterday. Mr. Nsita, the floor is yours. President Sita. I'd like to thank the presiding judge for offering me the floor. I shall open the closing arguments for the legal representatives, and my colleague Mayombo Kasongo shall follow me, and then our colleague Mr. Saidou Doumbia shall close for us from the field. So I shall now begin straight away, if that suits, Your Honour. Presiding Judge. Yes, indeed, feel free. The floor is yours. Mr. Nsita. Your Honours, I have the honour of opening these proceedings on behalf of the legal representatives of victims. Now, I shall be as brief as possible to allow my colleagues to have the time they need to address the court. Now, I would like to spend some time on the specificities of the role of the legal representatives of victims and the limits of that role. I will then turn to some key points in this particular case, points which were addressed more particularly by the two victims that testified before this court. And then I'll say a couple of words regarding the scale of the impact and the nature of the scars left by the occupation in Timbuktu. Now, first of all, it is important to recall that the interests of the legal representatives of victims are different to those of the prosecutor. The prosecutor, who we heard address the court yesterday, and the prosecutor was presenting evidence to demonstrate the guilt of Mr. Al-Hassan for the crimes of which he is accused. Now, we listened closely to what the prosecutor said and his presentation of his case, and we share his opinion regarding the evidence and the necessity to find the accused guilty. However, our interests as representatives of victims or as victims is broader still. The purpose for us of this trial is to serve the interests of the victims, and that is to uncover the truth regarding what took place in Timbuktu in 2012 and January 2013, and to see the rights of the victims upheld in justice. I would underline that the victims are not participating simply to obtain some kind of financial compensation. No, they're participating so that the harm that has been done to them and the crimes that have been perpetrated against them be known. Now, it's always most unpleasant for victims to hear said that they are participating only to obtain reparations. No. What is important to them is the truth and recognition of what happened to them, particularly when the accused denies the crimes. So it is, in fact, quite insulting when victims hear it said that all they're interested in is compensation. Now, Now, 2,196 victims have been authorized to participate in these proceedings. 2 victims testified on their behalf in this court. Now, these victims come from all categories of all quarters of the community in Timbuktu who lived through these events. Their views and concerns have been gathered by us, and we have tried to take into account their individual views as well as the larger positions in which they have adopted as groups. It can be a frustrating task to represent victims, or it has been frustrating to represent the victims in this case, because we as representatives have not been authorized to travel to visit the victims in Timbuktu and to visit the sites of the crimes, the scene of the crimes, and to meet our clients. This has proven to be a handicap to us. We have had to just get by, and our familiarization with the case and with the locations which are relevant to this case have been hampered in that way. We have, however, been able to meet our clients in Bamako. Now, victims have needed to go through intermediaries to approach the court. They have approached NGOs, and those NGOs have supported the victims. It is, however, important to remember that the defence has not proved that the evidence on file has been contaminated owing to the involvement of individuals or entities which it alleges contributed to a narrative that did not reflect the truth or whose behaviour was questionable with regard to court procedures. The victims have been seeking justice for many years now, and much has been promised by the national authorities, but that those promises have not been made good. And that has, in fact, blighted the hope of the victims. And it makes the proceedings before this court all the more important to them. They have been following these proceedings with the means available to them and are mindful of the role that is theirs with respect to the claims of the defence and the position of the accused. Now, some of the claims and positions which have been adopted or have been presented in this court have been quite upsetting to victims, notably regarding the application of Sharia and the minimization of the conduct of criminals. It has been asserted that what went on in Timbuktu was nothing more or less than practices which were already accepted in that city. Now, it is unacceptable for victims that the scale of privation and the violations of their fundamental rights be misrepresented in this way, and that the acts of persecution committed against the local population be justified in any way. Now, the prosecutor has described the rather tyrannical regime to you. It wasn't just a matter of wearing a full veil, for instance, and covering yourself from head to foot. And that being a price which at the end of the day might have been acceptable to victims to be able to get on with their lives in Timbuktu. No, breaking the rules was punished. And it's precisely because those rules did not reflect existing practice in Timbuktu up to that point in time, that a system of sanctions had to be developed and put in place. As without such a system, those rules would not have been needed, would not have been heeded. Now, as victim V0001 said, each time that a woman was stopped who was not dressed appropriately, they beat her. And any time that a man and woman were stopped together, they would both be beaten. And you will find that on transcript 168 at page 33. Victim V0002 said, in response to a question as to why the women who normally worked in associations could not leave their homes to do their work, what that victim said was, well, for the first reason, it's because they were afraid to leave their homes and encounter the jihadists. And secondly, there was mandatory clothing that they had to wear to leave their home. And if they made a mistake, the mistake of going out and being in contravention of the rules, then they would be in trouble. Now, the case file shows just how often these arrests took place and the consequences for those who were arrested. These were not just occasional cases of being stopped and questioned, but rather it was a case of repeated acts of violence, which were systematic, and arrests which were very frequent, and you have heard much about the consequences and the impact of that on the victims. Those consequences still play on their minds and affect their body in the case of many of them. Similarly, it wasn't a matter of practices which were similar to arranged marriage, which is unquestionably practiced in the region. No. V001 explained the nature of these forced marriages. Now, what he said, and in transcript 168, page 34, lines 23 to 28, was that they, and he meant by this, and I put this in brackets, the mujahideen and the bearded men, close brackets, V001 said that those people just described arrived in our home. They saw my mother, and they said that they had come to greet the family. They asked me if I was married, and my mother said that I was married. The gentleman answered that they had inquired in the neighborhood and they had found out that I was married, and said that they wanted to marry me. Now, V001 refers to the fact that she was taken by force in marriage. And she said he closed the door. There was only he and I inside. We were in the house where he had taken me. What he had done was abduct me. As they knew that I didn't love them, they had come, laid down the sum of money, and taken with me. That was at transcript 168, page 39, lines 26 to 27. And she goes on to say that as soon as we entered the home, he took me into the bedroom and he put me on the bed. I jumped up from the bed and went under the bed. He took me out of there, put me on the bed, and he took me with force. He did what he did with full force. V0001 also explained in detail the conditions of life in the city, the conditions of her life in her forced marriage. She said that I wasn't allowed to leave. I didn't have authorization to leave. I never left. It was my husband who would do the shopping and make the meals. He was fearful of being poisoned. And as a consequence of this, victim 0001 bore a child by the man to whom she had been married by force. And she explained to us in very moving terms in this courtroom, or rather painful terms, she explained the life of that child and how that child had suffered, the child which is labeled child of a mujahideen to this day. Now, we have heard about all of the rules which were applied, which affected all aspects of life. We heard about violence against people, including sexual violence, violence and assaults on people, and violence and damage caused to goods. The crimes which were committed must not be forgotten. Similarly, V002, in response to a question put to him during his testimony, said, and I quote, "Your Honor, when a city becomes dead, there is no escape. There is no entering, there's no leaving. There's no trading, there's no market. There's no fair. What will be the fate of such a city?" I simply mean to say that the community, the locals, they suffered during the occupation. They suffered financially. When you don't have any money, how are you going to pay to feed yourself? And when you don't leave your home, and I'm speaking here particularly about women, all all that we earn to cover our needs and to have a social life, we have to go out to earn, to get what we need, to sell what we have on the market. We have to leave our homes to go into to the gardens, etc. Sir, all of that comes to an end. End of quotation. The acts which were committed on 2012 and 2013 in Timbuktu show the persecution that was perpetrated against the population. These victims continue to suffer the consequences of the occupation. The traumatism, the trauma which they have suffered has not healed. Their bodies and their souls continue to suffer. But beyond that, Timbuktu has not recovered socially or economically. The damage which was done is still apparent. It's apparent in the tissue of society. The city was a cultural melting pot and an ethnic melting pot. It has not recovered, nor has its economic life. Now, the occupation caused many people to flee the city. So many former people or residents of Timbuktu are now found outside of Mali or elsewhere in the country. There were 10 months of occupation, and that sufficed to disrupt a city in such a way that the repercussions are felt to this day. Your Honours, in these terms, I wanted to bring to your mind the larger context of the judgment which you will hand down, a judgment which will be of the utmost importance of the victims not only of Timbuktu, but of all of northern Mali. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Maître Nsita, pour votre...
Presiding Judge, thank you very much, Mr. Nsita, for that very clear presentation. So, would you like to introduce the next speaker from your team? Mr. Nsiti. Yes, I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Mr. Mayombo, Presiding Judge. Mr. Mayombo, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Kasongo Mayombo. Thank you, Your Honours. I would like to thank my colleague, Mr. Nsita, for having given an excellent introduction to the set of submissions which we'll be making today. I am Mr. Kasongo and one of the legal representatives of victims in this case, as Mr. Nsita explained. Now, I will follow on from what he has said. And I will add to what he has said as regards our oral submissions. Now, what I have to say is based on, well, 3 aspects, I would say. First of all, the damage done. The damage done as it is expressed by the victims themselves. Not only the civilian population, the larger group, if you like, but also the city of Timbuktu as an entity. And the third aspect of what I have to say will be what the victims have to say regarding the accused in this case. Your Honours, first of all, if I might, I would, on behalf of my colleagues who are listening, I would like to present the thanks of all of the victims who are taking part in these proceedings. Over 2,000 victims, as Mr. Nsita explained. Now, these victims thank you not only for having conducted this trial, but they would also like to thank the parties, the Office of the Prosecutor, on the one hand, and the defense, who have assisted Mr. Al-Hassan, on the other hand. Now, Your Honours, I would like to present a number of ideas. Now, in the submissions which have been made by the victims through their legal representatives or what they have written in their participation forms, you have read what they have had and heard what they have had to say. The term that they have used is occupation. They use other words, such as jihadist or Tuareg. They use the term destruction. They refer to mausoleums. They refer to the BMS. They refer to the governorate. Now, these are key words. These are key words which allow us to illuminate the chamber further. Because your chamber has heard what the victims have had to say. You have heard you have heard them testify. You have heard them be examined by the prosecution and by the defense, examination chief, in cross-examination. We have questioned them too. The terms used by the victims will also illustrate to you what it is that our expectations are of this court. They have expressed themselves by approaching this court, by filling in their participation forms. All of these victims responded to one particular question, and that question was, what do you expect of these proceedings? Now, all of them, Your Honours, had the expectation that this chamber would convict the accused. Would convict the accused provided that the alleged crimes were proven. And those crimes have been proven. That is the state of affairs at the end of this trial. Your Honours, there is no longer any doubt in the eyes of the victims that we represent. There's no doubt in their minds at this stage in the proceedings that the crimes have been proven. There is no doubt but that the witnesses have been heard. Your Honours, we are the spokespersons for the victims of Timbuktu. These victims have suffered from the conflict which raged in northern Mali in 2012. Not only did they find themselves in a situation not of their making, but they found them in a situation not of their making in Timbuktu and in the surrounding region, because Timbuktu is more than a city. Timbuktu as a region was taken during that armed conflict, and it lost its historical aura. Its inhabitants were forced to air the earth. Many were displaced by the situation. Others had to take refuge in neighboring countries. Now, Your Honour, one needs to understand and be clear that through this trial, the crimes that the victims have alleged have been proven. And at the outcome of these proceedings, it is abundantly clear that the facts have been proven. Now, we, as legal representatives of the victims, myself and my colleagues, we have considered this matter. We have travelled to visit those victims who have been displaced. I have visited with them, and I have asked them what their expectations were of this trial. To that, I visited victims in countries located in proximity. I won't cite the names of those countries, but I took note of what it is, what their views and concerns were. Now, Your Honours, those victims said that they were fearful of returning home. They were afraid to return to Timbuktu, be it the region or, more specifically, the city. They are still afraid to find themselves face to face with the police, as they tell me, or to find themselves, that is to say, the Islamic police, of course, or to find themselves face to face with the jihadists. In the minds of these victims, the occupiers are still there. Now, the witnesses who testified in this court, witness 626, summarized the matter. The police took measures, and then they would take a person and put that person in prison. Now, it is this fear to find oneself grappling with such a system which is causing victims to remain abroad and to stay in exile. The occupier was embodied in the police, and they have told me that given that fact, a return to them is highly hypothetical. All of those victims continue to look to this court to see a practical outcome to these proceedings, a solid, concrete step. Now, Your Honours, as regards these victims, these are victims from Timbuktu. They are very attached to their ancestral land and to the saints who are in fact their ancestors. their common ancestors. They would venerate them in the mausoleums. The mausoleums were sacred sites where prayer would take place and worship would take place. These victims still suffer mental anguish today in 2023. And have done since the destruction and the occupation. Their wounds remain open. When Timbuktu was taken, the descendants of the saints left Timbuktu. They now heir the earth. When they speak, almost every one of them talk about their mental distress, their emotional suffering. Now, this court has undoubtedly read those participation forms which express their distress. It is distressful for them not to be able to visit the place where their ancestors lie and to no longer be able to venerate them as they did, to no longer be able to take part in the blessings, the veneration, the mysticism, and the traditional way of practicing their faith. Now, the people of Timbuktu have been suffering emotionally due to the destruction of the mausoleums by the jihadists, including Ansar ad-Din and Akin, who have been referred to much during these proceedings. Mr. Al-Hassan was a member of those groups. And it's because these saints were in fact their ancestors and that they owe them veneration. It is for that reason that this is particularly painful for them. Now, witness 608 testified before this court and said that Sidi Mahmoud is referred to as the people of Timbuktu as the saint of saints. And I don't really know why. But we know why, Your Honours, because we have discussed these matters with the with the descendants of the saints. Now, this lack of respect for the saints is at the source of the suffering felt by the victims who are in exile or displaced. Their society has been disrupted. Their families have been torn apart. And that has caused true wounds to them. Normally, those abroad would want to return to Timbuktu to continue the veneration of the saints, but that is no longer possible. And even those in the country cannot do so. And this is of tremendous harm to the people of Timbuktu. Now, Your Honours, they couldn't just simply continue to pray to the ancestors. No, according to their customs and traditions, they needed to be on site. And this was all part of the prestige of Timbuktu. Timbuktu has lost its prestige due to the destruction of the mausoleums and due to the occupation by the jihadists. And that is why the victims talk time and time again about the occupation. The occupation. You see it throughout their forms. But let's talk about the occupation, Your Honours. This was an occupation not only of Timbuktu, but beyond Timbuktu, an occupation in wider northern Mali. Now, during that period of time, the population was simply powerless because they had no means to defend themselves. Let's remember, it was an armed occupation, and the local people did not have weapons. The local people saw a vast amount of destruction. joined forces, the occupants joined forces to destroy what they found. How could the local people resist what they were doing? The occupation humiliated families. The families are the descendants of the saints. And the saints, as I've explained, are members of their families. They are their ancestors. So the people of Timbuktu felt as if they had lost a member of their family. And the occupation was due to the jihadists. And one of the victims spoke of this, 608. They said they have not come here to do us good. They say they're coming here to bring Sharia. That's what the victim said. Now, Your Honours, in the case of an occupation, there is one choice open to the locals. Either they flee or they stay and possibly die. That was the dilemma faced in Timbuktu. And that's why they fled and took refuge. And that's why they are hoping so strongly that you will find the accused guilty in this case. Now, one victim, victim 160, stated that the community recognized the armed groups Mujau, and Sardine and Akim as being the occupiers. For the locals, the identity of their occupiers was at one point unclear. They had mixed ideas on it. Now these things are totally clear to them at the end of this trial. They're absolutely clear on what groups were involved, groups of which Mr. Al-Hassan was a member. They have no doubt about how those armed groups attacked Timbuktu and the people. Your Honours, the occupation was a perfect example of that tradition of Tuaregs taking possession of Malian territory. That is to say, Malian territory in the north. Now, if you will allow, I shall quote from a piece of Malian literature. The authors were Shogoual Kokala Maiga and Isiaka Ahmadou Sangare. And they wrote about the rebellions in northern Mali, from the origins thereof to our days. And those authors wrote that on the 6th of April 2006, late President Mohamed Gaddafi traveled to Bamako, to travel from Bamako to Timbuktu to celebrate Maulid. He had slipped the notice of the Malian services and disappeared for a few hours to meet with the Tuareg tribes. Upon arrival there, the authors state, he had no compunction about proclaiming his support for the creation of a Tuareg state spanning from Mauritania to Iraq. And it is that concept of things that underlined the occupation of Timbuktu. The population had no choice when it came to occupation, using force as a way of communicating with the people, obliging them to obey or risk their lives. Now, Your Honours, as I said, I'm not going to take too much time because I want to allow my colleagues the opportunity to share further with you. But I would now like to talk about the nature of the crimes which have been alleged against the accused.
The victims involved in this trial have no doubt about the reality of the crimes as they are known today. And before, when there was no clarity, there was a common mention of jihadists in the absence of the application forms for participation. But as at today, the perpetrators of these crimes have an identity contrary to the general expression of jihadist. Mr. Al-Hassan has been recognized and is known as the perpetrator of those crimes to them, and that will be the case at the end of this trial. It has been said that the crimes were committed by jihadists, including Mr. Al-Hassan, who was part and parcel of the group. He stood in solidarity with them and acted with them and agreed with the system set up for repression and occupation. Your Honors, the victims who were held in detention at the facilities of the Islamic police have demonstrated the involvement and participation of the accused person throughout this trial. And I am sure that everyone whom we represent at this stage in the proceedings is aware of this. So, through us, the victims are telling you that the accused person before you is indeed the person who was identified in page 1 of the victim's participation application form. The one appearing before you has been recognized through various testimonies before your chamber. You see, when there's a trial, there has to be an interaction of evidence, inculpatory and exculpatory, and the onus is on the prosecutor to indeed make his case. And with all parties and participants, all these charges have been discussed before your court. Your Honors, these crimes committed have a cultural dimension against the city of Timbuktu, whose mausoleums were destroyed, although they are part of a world cultural heritage. Your Honors, the victims whom we represent today and who have participated in this trial pray you to put the accused person on the path to conviction, and they urge your chamber to come to the determination that such an outcome will satisfy the expectations of the victims. I now hand over to Maître Doumbia while thanking you, and as he goes on to give further details on our representations regarding the victims. Thank you very much.
Pour votre brillante présentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kasongo, for your presentation, and I will now give the floor to Maître Doumbia.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Your Honors. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to appear as a legal representative of victims before you this morning. I would like to draw on the essence of what the victims whom we represent feel again even this day. Mr. President, Your Honors, it is all very clear. After the closing statements submitted yesterday so eloquently by the Office of the Prosecutor, and after the statements made by my learned colleagues this morning, Maître Kasongo and Maître Nsita, I simply have to be brief. Brief, as you have repeatedly reminded us, to uphold the principle whereby that which has been said and well said does not need to be repeated, or at least does not mean that we dwell on it beyond reasonable measure before your chamber. Having said this, Mr. President, Your Honors, mindful of the fact that the cause of the victims and the cause of the OTP are intricately linked, allow me to simply revisit a few extremely important aspects which will not only help to allay the fears of the victims whom we represent who are listening to you, but will also address a few pedagogical issues. And as you know, sometimes repetition has its merit. First of all, Mr. President, I would like to pay homage to you and your chamber on behalf of the victims whom we represent. And rightly so, for the manner in which you have conducted this trial, symbolic as it were, because in fact, for the legal representatives of victims as well as for the victims, the holding of this trial is already a victory. It is the victory that acknowledges a recognition of their status as victims of the crimes that were perpetrated in Timbuktu in 2012. Mr. President, Your Honors, the significantly high number of victims in this trial victims who were admitted by your chamber to participate in these proceedings is testament, if necessary, to the fact that you and your chamber indeed took the full measure of the scope of the tragedy that befell Timbuktu in 2012. The harm and suffering ensuing therefrom being beyond estimation.
C'est pour cette raison, Monsieur le Président,
It is for this reason, Mr. President,
et surtout compte tenu
and particularly mindful
du peu d'incidents
of
retenus à titre
the
des différentes charges,
paucity of incidents relating to the charges in this
les
trial,
représentants légaux des victimes
that the legal representatives of victims ask you
de faire des constatations
to
explicites
come to very
dans votre arrêt,
explicit determinations in
constatations
your
reflètent
judgment,
l'étendue des préjudices
whereby you will establish the scope of the harm suffered because of the crimes for which the accused person is charged in relation to that suffering inflicted on the victims in Timbuktu. Mr. President, there's a second reason
et encore une bonne raison de vous rendre hommage
and a good reason for our satisfaction and our homage on behalf of the victims and ourselves who are their
qui est
representatives.
que
That reason is the following. We
la participation au
believe
procès
that
constitue déjà une forme de réparation.
when victims participate in a trial, that in itself is already a form of reparation, a
Cela
type of
est
reparation.
consacré désormais par la jurisprudence
And this is already established in the jurisprudence of this court.
En effet,
In fact,
dans le jugement rendu sur l'application
in the judgment on the application of Rule 74 of the statute,
la reconnaissance de l'ampleur des préjudices
a recognition of the scope of the harm suffered arising from the crimes charged
et de leur diversité
and the attendant diversity
serait une forme
amounts
reconnaissance
to some kind
droit à la
of
vérité
recognition of their right to the truth,
et de ce fait une forme de réparation.
and thereby a type of reparation.
Les représentants légaux sollicitent
The legal representatives, therefore,
que le jugement qui sera
call
rendu
on the chamber to
par
be
votre chambre
mindful in their
procède à la
judgment
reconnaissance de ce
to
droit à la vérité
recognize this right to the
sur le
truth
fondement de l'article
based
74
on Article 74
du statut,
of the Rome Statute,
et ce, quel que soit le verdict.
regardless of the ruling
Monsieur le Président,
on
honorable
guilt.
juge,
Mr. President, Your Honors,
à présent, les représentants légaux
the legal representatives
sollicitent votre attention soutenue
also want to draw
pour mieux
your
apprécier
kind and sustained attention to two words,
deux mots essentiels,
which will enable you to understand
deux mots
these two words even better.
de lourd sens,
Two words that are laden with meaning,
qui constituent le cœur
two words that are at the very heart of our closing statements.
Premièrement,
And the first word is,
titre principal,
and that is the main word or
les
expression,
représentants légaux
let me say that the legal representatives of victims,
estiment que
victims
Al-Hassan
as a whole, are of the view
dans
that
les liens de l'accusation
Mr. Al-Hassan should be
est donc déclaré coupable
found guilty and bound by the charges brought against him. All of the charges, may I say, I repeat, all the charges brought against him.
Deuxièmement, à
Secondly,
titre accessoire,
and subsidiarily,
les représentants légaux des
the
victimes
legal representatives of victims
estiment qu'aucun motif
believe that
exonératoire
there is
de responsabilité,
no exonerating
même partielle,
ground that would absolve him of
devrait être
liability, be it partial, and that no such exoneration or exemption should be granted to Mr. Al Hassan. The accused person does not and is not in a position
d'aucun
to
motif exonératoire
avail himself of any exculpatory grounds of responsibility, be they partial or not.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, Your Honors,
le verdict que la Chambre rendra
the verdict that will flow from your chamber
devrait tenir compte
must or should
des brûlures
take into consideration
constantes.
the constant
Les
burning
victimes de Tombouctou ont vécu
that the victims of Timbuktu experienced and continue to experience in their body and in their souls.
la preuve de ces brûlures.
These burnings, if one may say, Mr. President, have been sufficiently put into evidence before you by the prosecutor.
Qu'il nous soit simplement permis ici
We therefore simply want to
de mettre
say
l'emphase sur quelques points constants.
and to emphasize here a few of those points which have
Ce qui est constant,
remained
Monsieur le Président,
absolutely
honorable juge,
constant.
dans un premier temps,
First of all, Mr. President, Your Honors, what has been constant
djihadiste de
is
Tombouctou
that
a
the
été la
jihadist
cause
occupation
première
of
et la
Timbuktu
cause
was the
déterminante
primary and determining cause
de la dislocation
of
de la société
the dislocation of
et de
the
l'éparpillement irréversible
society and irreversible disbursement that is ongoing of the population of Timbuktu. This dislocation has had political and economic consequences, which were outlined before your chamber by my learned colleagues who spoke before me on this matter.
fait qui est constant
A second constant
dans cette procédure,
fact in this trial
c'est le rôle
is
aussi déterminant,
the very significant,
principal
the principal and important role played by Mr. Al Hassan
en tant que responsable au
in
sein de la police
his capacity as an official of the Islamic police
dans la perpétration et la
when it
perpétuation
comes to perpetrating and perpetuating the crimes that were committed in Timbuktu in 2000.
crime qui
12.
a consisté en l'assujettissement de
Those
la population
crimes
au nom de l'islam,
led to the subjugation of Timbuktu's
c'est-à-dire
population
au nom d'un islam
on behalf of Islam, on behalf of one
qui a
might
consisté
say
également dans la
and
chosification
a
de la
false Islam, which in fact ended up in
de la déshumanisation
making
des êtres humains.
women or turning women into objects and simply dehumanizing the human being.
Ce que nous appelons
These
traitement inhumain
things are otherwise referred to and as inhumane and highly degrading treatment which was inflicted on the people. And these things do not do honor to the human being. Mr. President, Your Honors, the Office of the Prosecution placed before this court the irrefutable evidence on this point, arising not only from witness testimonies, but also from Mr. Hassan himself. Not only testimonies and statements, the OTP further provided images, horrible images, in evidence. Profoundly disturbing images were placed before your chamber by the Office of the Prosecutor here in this court. The third constant point, Mr. President, Your Honors, is also an irrefutable point, namely that Al-Hassan, the accused, is not what one could refer to as a choir boy. Well, it is clear that the defense will attempt to establish the contrary, but we all know that we cannot be fooled. Mr. President, let me present to you the image, the exact image that remains in the minds of the victims in Timbuktu, the image they have of Mr. Al-Hassan. So here we go. In the eyes of the victims of Timbuktu, the accused Al-Hassan is the prototype of the cold-blooded monster, intrepid and violent, totally insensitive to human suffering. That is the image they have of him. Mr. President, it is all very clear. Al-Hassan is not a choir boy. Only a hardened heart could have discharged the functions and duties that were his within the Islamic police. It is not by happenstance that Al-Hassan was selected to play that role which was his within the Islamic police. It was indeed an acknowledgement of his qualities as a Qaid. That is, he was not a choir boy. Mr. President, let me conclude by saying that besides and beyond the highly psychological harm,
de préjudice matériel,
and in addition to the material damage, harm
marge
suffered,
préjudice
and
physique.
beyond the physical injuries,
Les représentants légaux des victimes voudraient attirer singulièrement votre
the
attention
legal representatives of victims want to particularly draw your attention
sur
to
certains préjudices de
some
nature particulière
other specific types of harm that were suffered,
et qui font aujourd'hui la hantise
which
de bon nombre de victimes
today continue to haunt a number of victims,
et dont nous-mêmes, représentants légaux, en avons pris conscience
with whom we have interacted and have fully become aware of such harm on a daily basis in the course of our
déplacés.
discussions with these displaced persons.
Quand je parle de déplacés,
When I talk about displaced persons, I am referring, of course,
préjudice
to
d'éloignement.
the harm of being separated from home.
Monsieur le Président, le préjudice d'éloignement
Mr. President, that
concerne
harm
une partie
of being
importante
separated from home
des victimes participantes
is a very important aspect of what the participating victims have told
des
us,
membres de la population de Tombouctou
particularly in relation to members
la
of
région
the population
sans aucune possibilité
of Timbuktu
de retour.
who had to go into exile without any
Ce
possibility
préjudice comporte
of
également
returning
une composante
home.
fortement psychologique
Exile has a strongly psychological
dont
component
les effets sont destinés à durer longtemps
whose effects clearly
lorsque la victime
last a very long
va
time
s'intégrer
when the victim is unable
au nouvel environnement
to integrate
et ne dispose
their new
pas de moyens
environment,
de retourner sur le lieu de vie originel.
and when they don't have the resources that can enable them
Tel
to return
l'immense
to their
majorité
original
que nous avons.
homelands. This is the fate of a vast majority of victims whom
Monsieur le
we
Président,
met.
au suivant,
Mr. President, the next
il y a
specific harm
perte
is
de la scolarisation.
loss of education.
La perte de la scolarisation
By loss of education,
avec des conséquences sur le
I
long
mean
terme
something which has long-term consequences on many children
qui n'ont pas été en
who
mesure
were unable
de rattraper
to catch up
le retard lié à la fermeture
the time lost
des écoles.
because schools had been closed.
Mieux, il y a
Let
des
me
milliers,
further say
des centaines,
that
des milliers
thousands or hundreds of thousands of
qui ont
children
définitivement
simply
perdu leur chance,
lost
du moins leur droit à l'éducation.
their opportunity, or should I say their right to an
Mais
education,
aussi en une perte
and that
de chance,
in fact is a loss of
comme
opportunity
dirait, une chance de devenir quelqu'un,
to become somebody,
pour justement dire
as one would say,
une chance de gagner dignement sa
or indeed a chance to earn one's living with dignity.
Troisièmement, Monsieur le Président,
Third point, Mr. President,
au nombre de ces préjudices qui frappent,
some of this harm has severely
c'est le préjudice
impacted
transgénérationnel.
the victims in a transgenerational manner.
Les
Transgenerational
représentants rappellent
harm.
qu'il est désormais reconnu
Allow
devant
us,
cette chambre
the legal representatives to remind the court that the court
que le traumatisme psychologique
has recognized that psychological
subi par
trauma
une victime directe
that a direct victim may suffer
aura des répercussions sur ses enfants,
could have repercussions on
indépendamment
their
du
children,
fait que ces derniers
whether
n'ont pas
or
vécu
not
l'élément
those
générateur
children experienced
traumatisme
the
parental.
trigger for the trauma of their parents.
Le préjudice
So,
spécifique
the specific harm
des enfants
relating to
nés de mariage
children born out or born of forced marriages
parfaitement
is also a perfect
ce cas
illustration or example
que nous avons vécu en direct
of this case, which we all experienced live
V001
when V001
qui cumule les préjudices d'enfants nés d'un viol,
testified about an accumulation of harm, including
dans le
a
cadre
child born
d'un
of rape
mariage forcé
committed within the context of a forced marriage,
et qui s'est très certainement
And
pu transmettre une part du traumatisme propre à sa mère.
clearly the child born of those circumstances
Personnelle.
did receive by transmission the trauma
Le
of
président honorable juge,
its mother because of the life that the child lived. So, Mr. President, Your Honors, I would prefer to stop here
en espérant
while hoping
que ces quelques mots
that in these few selected words,
vont peser dans la balance
we have been able to bring
moment où vous
the
allez
chamber
vous retirer pour
to
délibérer.
take them into consideration as you withdraw to
Pour
deliberate.
délibérer sur la culpabilité
To
de
deliberate
Al-Hassan.
on the guilt of Mr. Al-Hassan.
Et lorsque vous aurez pris votre
And
décision
when you would have come to your determination
sur la question principale, celle de la culpabilité, vous répondrez
regarding the main issue of guilt, your answer will be yes, he is guilty.
et ce faisant,
In so doing,
vous pouvez tranquillement aller vous reposer
you would be able to find rest.
et lorsque vos enfants
And when your children
vont vous demander ce que vous aviez fait de votre journée,
will ask you how your day went,
vous leur répondrez
you would tell them,
certainement que l'homme était enclin à
well,
la justice ce jour-là
there was a man
et que vous avez prononcé
who came
oui,
before the court on that
un
day
verdict de culpabilité
and you found him guilty
parce que ce monsieur
because that man
à juste titre
rightly deserved
le traitement infligé pour dissuader
the
désormais
treatment
que nul alors
that would dissuade anyone,
ne s'imaginer
anyone whosoever,
ne puisse prétendre
from
commettre les mêmes
attempting to commit the same types of crimes with impunity.
faits. Ce sera justice
That would be justice done,
et ce serait sans doute, sans nul doute,
and that would clearly
un grand pas
be
dans la construction de la justice
a leap
internationale.
forward in the building of international
Construction qui est
justice,
notre devoir,
which we are invited to be part of,
mais dont la
all of
charge
us,
principale
but
repose aujourd'hui sur vos épaules.
about which the main responsibility lies on your shoulders, going by the decisions
Là-dessus, Monsieur le
that
Président, honorable
you
juge,
render. On that note, Mr. President, Your Honors,
je laisse entre vos mains le sort de ces victimes,
I leave in your hands
en vous réitérant
the fate
la
of
confiance
the victims,
absolue.
while reiterating to you the absolute confidence that I have in you all.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doumbia, for your eloquent and brilliant statement. Well, when it comes to your advice to the judges relating to what they must tell their children, I ascribe that to your oratory skills. It is true that we as a chamber, we must deliberate, but then the stories we tell our children are something else. We still have 10 minutes. I don't know what Ms. Taylor thinks. I think that the legal representatives of victims have now concluded their statements. I think, Mr. Nsita? Mr. Nsita, yes, Mr. President, you're correct. Your Honors, the statement by Maître Sidou Dumba closes the statements from the legal representatives of victims. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Nsita. The legal representatives have respected the time frames, and I thank them for that. Ms. Taylor?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm ready to start now. Otherwise, we can also break now and return earlier if that's more convenient.
Tout à fait, Maître Taylor. Je posais juste la question. Mais...
Ms. Taylor, we are happy to break now and to resume at 11:30. Is that correct, Ms. Taylor?
Voilà, Maître Taylor est d'accord.
I see Ms. Taylor agrees. So let us break now and resume at 11:30.
L'audience est suspendue.
All rise, veuve lever.